Princess Catherine's poised silence transformed into something no one expected, a direct defiance of the monarch himself. What triggered this unprecedented fracture between the future queen and the reigning king? The grand courtyard of the palace shimmered under the spotlight of global attention. A formal state event had been arranged to symbolize harmony between generations, King Charles standing tall to represent the legacy of the past, while Princess Catherine was intended to embody the graceful continuity of the crown's future. But something about the atmosphere felt off from the very beginning. The usual choreography of tradition, welcoming gestures, practiced smiles, timed speeches felt rigid, strained. Those close enough to observe the royal family noticed the stiffness in Catherine's posture, the glint of something unreadable in her eyes. It wasn't the typical royal poise, it was something colder, more resolute. The press, ever watchful, whispered among themselves. Was the princess simply tired, or was something stirring behind the scenes? At first glance, the answer seemed buried beneath the elegance of the occasion. But those paying attention saw the cracks beginning with her attire. Catherine, known for her symbolism, had chosen a bold, deep hue that bore a striking resemblance to a historic dress worn by Princess Diana during a time of protest. Subtle, yes, but unmistakably deliberate. Then came King Charles's address, delivered with grandeur, yet laced with unmistakable undertones. His speech spoke of unity, of duty, of the necessity for the monarchy to preserve tradition in the face of fleeting trends. A line that many interpreted as a veiled warning. As his words floated across the royal grounds, Catherine stood motionless. But her face was no longer neutral. It was pale, clenched, her eyes locked on him, not with admiration, but with resistance. When the applause came, Catherine did not clap. The silence around her grew deafening. Even those seated nearby exchanged glances, sensing something had gone terribly off script. And then, without ceremony or warning, she stepped forward, interrupting the rhythm of the evening. Her movement alone shattered protocol. The cameras followed her instinctively, flashing in confusion and anticipation. Something historic was unfolding, and every heart in the crowd seemed to pause. Eyewitnesses later described it as a chill that swept through the air. Some thought she might have been reclaiming a role denied. Others believed it was the breaking point of months of internal warfare. Whatever the reason, it was clear Catherine had not come to stand beside the king. She had come to challenge him, and in doing so, she had violated every rule written and unwritten within the monarchy. But this wasn't just a spontaneous act of emotion. Catherine's bold defiance had been building behind palace walls for months, and what the world saw was only the final spark of a much deeper fire. Why would the beloved princess, often praised for her grace, suddenly challenge the monarchy she's poised to inherit? The answer lies in whispered arguments, sleepless nights, and a queen-in-waiting pushed too far. Behind the elegance and the carefully composed smiles, something had begun to unravel months before that public confrontation. Inside the palace walls, where cameras are forbidden and loyalties are tested in hushed tones, Catherine had been watching a storm gather around her family. Tensions between her and King Charles were no longer a matter of subtle gestures. They had evolved into sharp exchanges behind closed doors, fueled by decisions that cut too close to the throne she was destined to share with William. At the heart of this fracture was a series of choices made by the king that quietly chipped away at Prince William's authority. Royal appointments that should have gone to the heir were instead handed to figures loyal to Camilla's side of the family. Positions in the royal trust, ceremonial roles, even patronages with symbolic weight were redistributed in ways that felt less like evolution and more like erasure. For Catherine, this wasn't politics. It was personal. She saw not only her husband's legacy being diluted, but the crown's future being rewritten in favor of a lineage that had never belonged to it. The whispers grew louder. Rumors swirled through court corridors that King Charles had been exploring the possibility of giving Camilla's grandchildren certain royal honors that Catherine believed should be reserved for the bloodline of Diana and Charles, not extensions of a controversial second marriage. And while William remained diplomatic, urging patience and unity, Catherine's patience was beginning to fray. She hadn't spent years earning the people's trust, only to watch it be traded away in silence. Every mother fears the shadows that once consumed their family will one day reach their children. And Catherine had always carried Diana's legacy like a compass. In private, she often spoke of promises unspoken, yet sacred, made to William in their early years together. Promises to protect what Diana died fighting for: the integrity of her sons and the monarchy they were born to heal. The emotional toll was growing heavier by the day. Catherine felt increasingly isolated, trapped between a crown that demanded silence and a conscience that refused to sleep. The tipping point wasn't a single insult or public slight. It was 1,000 paper cuts, the kind only a woman in waiting can feel when the throne she's preparing for is quietly being pushed further away. And in that space of silent suffocation, Catherine made a vow. A quiet, unwavering vow that she would never allow history to repeat itself. That she would not stand by, like Diana once had, and watch power destroy truth. And yet, nothing could prepare her or the monarchy for what happened next. A carefully calculated move that shattered centuries of silent obedience. She wasn't scheduled to speak. No one expected her to. But when Princess Catherine stepped to the podium and addressed the crowd with trembling conviction, royal aides went pale. She had crossed the line. In a monarchy where every word is measured, every moment rehearsed, and every step choreographed, spontaneity is seen not as freedom, but as threat. That evening was no different. The agenda had been locked, the speakers confirmed, and Catherine was never supposed to hold a microphone. But as King Charles returned to his seat, his speech concluded with polite applause. Something unexpected occurred. Catherine didn't retreat. She moved forward. At first, many assumed she was adjusting her position or preparing to exit alongside the king. But when her hand reached for the microphone, a wave of unease swept across the stage. Courtiers exchanged silent glances. Staff members flinched. Protocol was being breached in real time, and no one could stop it. Catherine's voice, steady but quivering with emotion, broke through the stillness. She began not with greetings or formalities, but with a single word: truth. The air shifted instantly. She spoke of legacy not as a burden of bloodline, but as a responsibility to serve with dignity and honesty. Her words were not loud, but they cut like thunder through the polished silence. Without ever naming him directly, her speech made it clear she was responding to something. Her references to decisions made in the shadows, to traditions weaponized for personal ambition, and to a crown at risk of losing its moral compass, sent chills through the room. Thinly veiled, though her criticism was, everyone understood the target. Her speech wasn't aimed at the institution. It was aimed at the man who led it, King Charles himself. Some members of the audience cheered in disbelief, captivated by the sheer audacity of what they were witnessing. Others gasped, unable to process what was unfolding before them. The tension was so thick, it seemed to press down on the very ground beneath them, and at the center of it all stood Catherine, composed, unrelenting, and unapologetic. King Charles, seated just feet away, sat frozen. His jaw tight, his hands clasped together, he maintained the outward appearance of composure. But those closest to him later described his reaction as visibly disturbed. He had just been publicly challenged by the very woman poised to inherit the monarchy's future. Within minutes, phones lit up around the globe. Clips of Catherine's speech began flooding social media. Headlines erupted in real time. The day the princess spoke out. Commentators, journalists, and palace insiders scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. But none could deny that Catherine had broken a sacred rule, and in doing so, she had rewritten the monarchy's playbook. And while her words were cloaked in grace, the intent behind them sent a brutal message to the palace, one that could not be ignored or undone. As Catherine made history, her husband, Prince William, stood torn between two loyalties, his father's crown and his wife's truth. The heir to the throne suddenly found himself without a side to stand on. The moment Catherine's voice rang out before the world, all eyes shifted not only to her but to the man beside her. William, caught entirely off guard, betrayed a rare lapse in royal control. The cameras caught it a slight step back, the tightening of his jaw, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. In a family trained to remain unreadable, even the smallest crack spoke volumes. No one knew if he had been warned, if Catherine had whispered her intentions the night before, or if, like the rest of the nation, he was witnessing it all unfold in real time. And yet, there he stood, motionless as his wife challenged his father with words that echoed through the monarchy like thunder. In the hours that followed, the palace walls became a pressure chamber. Reports emerged of a fierce and deeply emotional exchange between William and King Charles behind closed doors. Sources described shouting something almost unheard of within those regal halls. The king, already wounded by what he viewed as betrayal, demanded answers. Why had William allowed it? Why hadn't he stopped her? William, ever the bridge between diplomacy and conviction, reportedly said just one thing. She spoke her heart. You cannot silence that. But the damage didn't stop there. Within the privacy of their own quarters, William and Catherine faced a reckoning of their own. Was it a coordinated stand? Or had Catherine stepped beyond the trust of her own husband? No one truly knows what passed between them that night, but insiders revealed that it was one of the most emotionally charged conversations they had ever endured. The future of their marriage wasn't in doubt, but the path ahead had split into two difficult roads, one paved with royal obedience, the other with defiant truth. The emotional toll on William was immense. He was not just a man witnessing a fracture between his wife and his father. He was the heir to a throne now surrounded by uncertainty. Every step he took would be scrutinized. Every gesture is interpreted. And yet, despite the mounting pressure, he made a quiet but unmistakable choice. He did not rebuke Catherine, not once. No statement was released, no distancing occurred. His silence became its own form of allegiance, one that shook the foundations of the monarchy even further. Behind palace walls, aides began to whisper that William's refusal to condemn the speech was a form of rebellion in itself. It sent a message not just to his father, but to the entire institution. Catherine may have broken protocol, but she had not broken their bond. William, torn by lineage and love, had chosen his side. But the royal family was not the only one shaken across the nation. Public opinion erupted in ways the crown could never have anticipated. Lines were drawn. On one side, the reigning monarch. On the other hand, the people's princess. Social media exploded. Polls shifted overnight. And suddenly, the future of the monarchy felt dangerously uncertain. In less than 24 hours, Catherine's act of defiance had gone from a royal scandal to a national obsession. Hashtags swept through every platform number. Team Catherine began trending across continents, matched only by a fierce counterwave under number Respect the King. The internet became a battleground, dividing generations, ideologies, and even families. While traditionalists clung to the idea of royal decorum, millions embraced Catherine's stand as a long-overdue reckoning. This was no longer about a single speech. It was about everything the crown had refused to confront for decades. Royal experts, commentators, and historians scrambled to contextualize what had just occurred. Many had spent years chronicling royal appearances, yet few could recall a moment that had so profoundly split the nation. The scale of support for Catherine stunned even her fiercest admirers. She wasn't simply seen as a wife defending her husband. She was now viewed as a woman confronting an entire system. Some called her a modern-day Diana. Others went further, claiming she had become the monarchy's conscience. Still, not everyone cheered. There were those who labeled her actions as dangerously subversive, treasonous even. To challenge the king in public, they argued, was to threaten the very fabric of monarchy. But even those voices struggled to drown out the seismic shift in public mood. Catherine had touched something deeper, an exhaustion with secrecy, with hollow gestures, with a crown more concerned with control than connection. Media outlets dove headfirst into the frenzy. Networks replayed her speech on a loop. Documentarians unearthed old clips of small, overlooked moments between Charles and Catherine that now seemed laced with hidden tension. Every pause, every glance, every half-smile was reanalyzed through a new lens. Had this feud been brewing for years, just beneath the surface? It wasn't long before public figures entered the fray. Politicians, celebrities, and international dignitaries began offering carefully worded support or criticism. Some praised Catherine's courage in calling for transparency. Others warned against emotional insubordination. The crown, suddenly thrust into a media firestorm it could no longer control, had no choice but to respond. A statement was issued from Buckingham Palace, neutral, restrained, and painfully vague. It praised the unity of the royal family, emphasized their shared commitment to tradition, and offered no mention of Catherine's name. But the damage was done. The omission itself became a headline. The silence spoke louder than words. And yet, within the shadowed halls of the palace, it wasn't public backlash that terrified the king. It was the next move Catherine quietly set into motion. It was more than defiance, it was a resurrection. By invoking the memory of the late Princess Diana, Catherine signaled that this was not just a rebellion, but a reckoning. Just days after her public speech shook the monarchy to its core, Catherine resurfaced not in an interview or palace photo op, but at a quiet charity event once closely tied to Diana's heart. It was a move that seemed simple on the surface, but the weight behind it was crushing. Draped around her neck was the unmistakable sapphire pendant Diana had worn during a turbulent chapter of her life, a symbol not of royalty, but of resistance. The message couldn't have been clearer. Catherine was stepping into the space Diana had once occupied, not as a victim of the crown, but as its conscience. The event itself was one that Diana had championed during her final years as an outreach initiative supporting victims of social neglect and systemic injustice. Catherine, calm and composed, addressed the crowd not as a princess, but as a woman speaking from conviction. Her voice trembled only once, when she referenced the legacy of those who dared to speak truth without fear. It was one line, one sentence, but it echoed with the power of generations stifled by duty. The media latched onto the symbolism instantly. Analysts, royal experts, and fans alike dissected every word, every gesture, every thread of her clothing. But beyond speculation, the public response revealed something far deeper. People weren't just seeing Catherine as a royal, they were seeing her as Diana's heir in spirit. Not chosen by title, but by truth. It became clear that Catherine wasn't trying to spark a war, she was trying to finish a story Diana never got to end. Inside the palace, however, the reaction was far from admiration. Royal insiders leaked whispers of King Charles's deeply personal pain. To him, the comparison to Diana felt like a wound reopened. For years, he had worked to reframe the public's memory of that turbulent era, offering quiet dignity, curated nostalgia, and a steady transition toward Camilla's acceptance. But with one appearance, Catherine had undone all of it. The ghost of Diana was no longer lingering in the background. It was front and center, and with it came judgment, emotion, and the public's memory of betrayal. Camilla, once seen as the woman who finally stabilized the king's life, now found herself eclipsed once more. Reports surfaced that she was in tears following Catherine's speech, feeling, once again, like the outsider who could never truly wear the crown without the shadow of Diana looming overhead. And though she tried to remain composed, those closest to her revealed that the resurgence of Diana's legacy had reopened old fears she thought long buried. As the echoes of Diana stirred unrest in the monarchy, King Charles made a bold decision of his own, one that would either restore order or ignite total collapse. Behind gilded doors, the confrontation unfolded. King Charles gave Princess Catherine an ultimatum: retract or be removed. But what happened next stunned even the most senior royal advisors. The palace meeting was called with urgency. No aides, no formalities, just father, son, and daughter-in-law in a room thick with tension. For days, Charles had endured the fallout in silence. The media storm, the divided public, the haunting image of Diana resurrected through Catherine's every move was all too much. He demanded clarity. What he wanted wasn't just a conversation, it was a submission. He began with pleasantries, but the undertone was razor-sharp. He told Catherine in no uncertain terms. Her actions had breached protocol, embarrassed the crown, and threatened the institution's stability. The only path forward, he claimed, was a public clarification, one that would restore order by reaffirming loyalty to the king. But Catherine didn't flinch. With a calm so deliberate it felt defiant, she looked the monarch in the eye and spoke only the words that mattered. The people deserve the truth. There was no apology, no retreat. Her voice carried none of the polish expected from a royal consort. Instead, it was heavy with purpose. She didn't shout, she didn't plead, she simply refused. And in that silence, the weight of her decision hit harder than any rebuke. Charles's composure cracked. His tone sharpened, frustration spilling out in veiled threats. If Catherine would not correct her statement, he warned, then ceremonial consequences would follow. Titles could be withheld, royal duties could be reassigned. Appearances, events, influence, all could be erased with the stroke of a signature. But even then, Catherine didn't waver. She had been preparing for this moment, perhaps long before anyone in that room even realized. She had drawn her line, and nothing the king said would move her from it. William sat between them, torn but resolute. For years, he had been the mediator, the son balancing two worlds. But not this time. When Charles turned to him, expecting support, he received something very different. "We lead together," William said, "or not at all." It wasn't just a defense of his wife. It was a challenge to the old guard, a statement that if Catherine fell, so would the unity of the future monarchy. The silence that followed was suffocating. Charles, cornered but unwilling to show defeat, issued one last threat. If Catherine would not bend, he would act. But Catherine, eyes unwavering, delivered the final blow. "Do what you must, but I won't be silent." Her words echoed like a hammer striking the very foundations of royal authority. The ultimatum had been answered not with fear, but with fire. The world thought the storm had peaked, but no one saw the final twist coming. A silent royal decree that exposed just how deep the fracture truly ran. Buried deep within Windsor archives, a letter from Queen Elizabeth II, long forgotten, suddenly resurfaced. Its contents, once private, now took on new weight as Catherine stood on the edge of royal exile. At the height of the palace crisis, with Catherine isolated and the monarchy in freefall, it wasn't an aide or advisor who came forward. It was Princess Anne. Known for her loyalty to protocol but guided by an unshakable sense of duty, Anne retrieved something from the Queen's private collection. A letter, handwritten, sealed, and addressed not to a name, but to a role. The future Queen Consort. It had never been sent, never spoken of, and perhaps never meant to see the light of day. But in that moment, as lines hardened and alliances crumbled, it became the single most powerful document in the royal vault. The Queen's words were measured, but unmistakably personal. She wrote not to flatter or instruct, but to empower. She spoke of a crown in need of renewal, of a family that must learn to lead by example, not by silence. "A queen," she wrote, "must often choose between comfort and courage. But the one who dares to speak, even when it shakes the room, is the one the world will follow." It was a quiet prophecy, and Catherine was living it. Anne delivered the letter herself, slipping it into Catherine's hand with no fanfare, just gravity. And when Catherine read it, something shifted. For the first time since her defiance began, she knew she was not alone. The Queen, in her final years, had seen this moment coming. And whether by intuition or foresight, she had left behind the one thing that no monarch, not even Charles, could contest: her written will. Catherine didn't release the full letter. She chose only a few lines to share with the public, enough to frame her actions not as rebellion, but as loyalty to the Queen's unspoken vision. The press devoured it. The people clung to it. Even her critics were forced into silence. This was not a rogue princess stirring drama. This was a woman fulfilling the hopes of the longest reigning monarch in British history. And for King Charles, the letter was devastating. To challenge Catherine now would be to challenge the Queen herself. To defy her mother's final wishes, to rewrite her legacy with pettiness, would risk not only his reign, but the monarchy's very survival. He stood frozen between tradition and truth, staring into a future that no longer obeyed him. With the crown hanging in the balance, all eyes turned to one final moment, a speech that would determine the fate of the monarchy. Catherine stood before the world not as a rebel, but as a leader. What began as defiance had transformed into something far greater, a movement to reshape the crown from within. The nation held its breath as Catherine returned to the public eye for one final address. This time, there were no surprises. It was a prepared speech, officially sanctioned, but nothing about it felt controlled. It wasn't a retraction. It wasn't an apology. It was a declaration measured, powerful, and unforgettable. Catherine began not with grandeur, but with humility. She thanked the British people not for their support, but for their honesty, for holding the monarchy accountable, for reminding the institution of its purpose. And then, with unshakable resolve, she did what no royal consort had dared to do in living memory. She demanded evolution. She spoke of a monarchy that must lead with compassion instead of superiority, with listening instead of silence. She spoke of mothers raising future leaders, of children growing up watching not titles but choices, and of a future where duty would never again come at the cost of humanity. She didn't name names. She didn't need to. The message was crystal clear. The monarchy, if it wished to endure, had to change from within. And she was willing to be the one who began that change. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Crowds gathered across the country, holding vigils, lighting candles, and waving banners bearing her words, "Courage over comfort." What had started as a constitutional scandal had become a cultural turning point. People weren't just supporting Catherine, they were seeing her as the future. Not just a queen consort, but a new kind of monarch. One who earned her crown not through inheritance, but through integrity. Inside the palace, the pressure mounted. King Charles, who had spent weeks resisting, was finally forced to break his silence not in a press conference, but in a private statement to senior aides. While never admitting fault, he acknowledged Catherine's strength, her voice, and the unshakable bond she held with the people. It was, in its own way, a reluctant surrender, and through it all, William remained by her side. No longer a man torn between two generations, but one who had chosen his path without regret. United, they emerged not as royal figureheads, but as leaders of a new vision, a monarchy grounded not in myth, but in meaning. A new image began to form, one where the crown rested not on silence and protocol, but on truth, resilience, and the quiet strength of a woman who dared to stand when no one else would. And in doing so, Catherine didn't just reclaim her place, she redefined what it meant to wear the crown. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.